Are you ready, kids? Hey, everybody. It's Friday, September 10th. We are going to be picking up with Chapter 2 today. Before I got started talking about the chapter notes, and we're not going to cover the entire chapter today like we did last week. Last week, we got through Chapter 1 in 1 week, so I did two videos over the entire chapter. One thing I want to address is I did get a couple of comments that the videos were too long. Well, I made a post about it on the Google Classroom. The videos aren't absolutely mandatory. I've got no way of checking to make sure that you watch the video, for one thing. All the material that I cover in the videos over my lecture notes, you've got the lecture notes themselves that I post on Google Classroom. You have the textbook. I make my lectures straight out of the material in the textbook. So if you don't have internet, or your internet your internet access is restricted, you can get by without the videos, but the same requirements are going to be placed on people. It's like this is a college class. Most of you are, at least to my knowledge, signing up or said you were interested in signing up for college credit. This is going to be treated like a college class. In college, if you don't show up for class, that material gets covered. You're still responsible for it. I'm going to do whatever I can to help you all, because these are not normal circumstances. I'm going to help you all any way that I possibly can. But again, you've got all the material that you need through the book, through the lecture notes. The videos are just supplemental, because there are some things, if you watch the videos, there are some things I'm not just reading straight off of the slides. I'm expanding on some things, trying to explain some things a little more than just the words that are on the screen. So again, the videos aren't absolutely necessary. They're not mandatory, but they are a good tool to help you prepare for quizzes, prepare for tests, which eventually we're going to get around to having tests. I'm still trying to figure out how I can give a test over remote learning, not easily, but effectively. But that's coming. So the videos, again, you don't have to watch them on Friday. If you're going to watch them, you can watch them in bits and pieces. That's why I posted them on YouTube, so you don't have to download them. And so you can watch them whenever. With the classroom stuff, stuff keeps getting bumped down the list. I very well, and I'll make posts in the classroom if I need to do this, but I also found out some of you that had problems watching the videos last week. The issue might have been, I didn't even consider it to be a problem, that it could potentially be a problem, but after talking to the district technology coordinator, if some of you had problems opening the video from the link on the classroom, it's because I posted it from my private, my personal Google or my personal YouTube account. What I might end up having to do, because I did notice one or two people subscribed to the channel, I'm probably going to have to make a new channel that is made with my school account. Once I do that, then there shouldn't be any problems. You should just be able to click on it and the video will pop up and play without any issues. I did talk about a workaround about how to get things open if you go in not with your school account but with a private account on the channel that I've already started. It should still work, but if I start a new channel with my school account, then you should be able to go straight in from the link in Google Classroom with your school account. So all of that being said, let's get into Chapter 2, the planning of the English colonies, and we'll get rolling from here. Like I said, I'm not going to cover the entire chapter, but again, these videos, since I am covering multiple days worth of lecture, we will, these are going to be longer videos, especially if I have any announcements or things that I need to talk about at the beginning of a video before we start. So Chapter 2 is about the beginning. In Chapter 1, we talked about where the Native Americans came from. We talked about Spanish colonization. But here with chapter 2, this is American history. We're starting to talk about where the English colonies came from, where America came from. Now, over time, we got some land from the Spanish, but by and large, the central part of our roots as Americans comes from English heritage. The English didn't start to colonize in North America until decades after the Spanish established their colonies in Central America and the Caribbean. Decades, we're talking multiple decades after the Spanish established the first permanent settlement in North America. The English, they get involved in 1607, and then the French, because they can't let the English have something that they don't have, the English jump in and they establish themselves a colony or in Quebec in 1608, the year after Jamestown. But the English did, I guess you could say, sniff around in North America for decades leading up to the point where they did finally take the plunge and begin to colonize with Jamestown starting in 1607. This slide is just, these first couple of slides are just build up to how the English got to the point of finally colonizing North America. One of the reasons that Columbus discovers the New World in 1492, and you don't see the English setting up their own colony in the New World until 1607, over 100 years later. It's because during the 16th century, during the 1500s, England had too many things going on to be bothered with colonization. They had more important things to deal with. You had, at the beginning of the 1500s, into the 1400s, beginning of the 1500s, there was a lot of strife. There was a lot of, there was a civil war that had to be dealt with initially, early on. That's one of the things that kept the English out of the colonization game. Then you had the establishment of a new ruling dynasty in England, the Tudor dynasty. And another thing is that in the first decades of the century, England was allied with Spain, and they didn't really want to do anything in terms of stepping on the Spanish toes, so to speak. They didn't want to infringe on any Spanish claims and thus endanger the alliance with Spain. Spain and France were major rivals. England and France were major rivals. Because Spain and England were allies, the English kings at the time, after the War of the Roses, the English Civil War, one of the English Civil Wars, what happens is the Tudor dynasty takes control, begins with Henry VII. Henry VII was allied with the Crown of Spain. He ends up arranging a marriage between his son, who would become Henry VIII when he becomes King of England, and Spanish princess, Catherine of Aragon. Since there was already an arranged marriage set up, again, to solidify the alliance between England and Spain, and Henry VII was busy trying to solidify his rule. I mean, his family and their allies had just gone through a civil war that had lasted for years with the House of York, the previous ruling family. And they had to make sure that their control of the country was stable and solidified. Henry VII started building up the British Navy, or the English Navy. Great Britain does not exist at this point. It's England, it's Wales, it's Scotland, it's Ireland. He knew, as an island kingdom, to protect himself from any possibility of foreign invasion, you got to have a strong navy. So he is concerned with solidifying his control of the country. He's concerned with building up his country's defenses. And he just never got around. He never had time to look at colonizing. I wouldn't say that there was absolutely no interest in it, but there were more pressing issues. When he dies and his son, Henry VIII, ends up taking the throne, Henry VIII was a busy man in the sense that, if you don't know about Henry VIII already, he was married 6 times. Uh, he had 2 of his ex-wives. The first wife, the Spanish princess, Catherine of Aragon, he had a daughter with her, but he wanted a son, and either Catherine couldn't or wouldn't have another child. So he fooled around, ended up falling in love with the daughter of a English noblewoman, and he asks the Pope, the head of the Catholic Church, for a divorce from Catherine. Well, because the King of Spain was one of the most powerful Catholics in the world, the Pope said, sorry, marriage is free. It's a vow that lasts forever, even though if you were powerful enough and you had the right connections, yes, the church would grant divorces, especially to powerful, influential political figures. But the Pope couldn't risk angering the King of Spain by granting a divorce, because, in the Catholic faith, divorce, especially at this point in history, divorce would have been looked at as something that would ruin Catherine's reputation for the rest of her life. Henry didn't like being told no. Any of you all that have ever watched South Park, I always envisioned Henry VIII being like Eric Cartman. So when the Pope told Henry VIII that he would not grant his request for a divorce, Henry VIII said,
screw you guys, I'm going to build my own church.
And that's exactly what he does. He gets the members of Parliament. He calls Parliament into session. He gets a representative in Parliament that's an ally of his to propose a bill to be voted on into law called the Act of Supremacy. The Act of Supremacy declared that the Pope was no longer in control of the church in England. The king was. So the king was not just the head of the government, the political leader, he would also become the religious leader, and he would be the head of the Church of England, as it was now called. This did cause a great divide in the English people, because people that were devout Catholics, they didn't like the idea of, well, first of all, they still considered themselves Catholics. They didn't consider themselves members of this new Church of England. But Henry, at the same time, as the political leader, he declared that it was law. Every person that lived in England was now a member of the Church of England, and you don't listen to the Pope anymore, you listen to the king. Since he was now the head of the church in England, he could grant himself a divorce. And that's exactly what he did. And he sent his first wife, Catherine, and their daughter, Mary, back to Spain. That is going to lead to complications down the road, because his daughter Mary ends up growing up hating her father. And when he dies, she's the second person in line for the throne. And eventually she does wear the crown of England for a little while. But what it was is Henry had been taught 2 things. While maybe they didn't believe in divine right monarchy, where the king receives their power from God, the king's word was absolute. That was one of the things he was taught by his father growing up. The second was, you have to have a male heir. You have to have a son to pass the crown to, because if you don't have a male heir, then your wife or your daughter you have a daughter, and the daughter becomes queen. When she marries, her husband becomes the king. That means that the Tudor bloodline will no longer control the throne of England. Whatever his family, whatever the son-in-law, the new king's family line would end up controlling the throne. So it was very important that he had a son. Well, Catherine gives him a daughter. His second wife that he marries Anne Boleyn, ends up having a daughter as well, Elizabeth. She also couldn't or would not have any more children. There were a lot of rumors about infidelity. that maybe the Queen was having an affair or affairs with members of the royal court. Henry thought he knew enough that he couldn't do anything to his wife for committing adultery, but supposedly he caught wind that there was a plot to take his life. So he has all of the conspirators and his wife, who was one of the conspirators supposedly, rounded up. They're put on trial very quickly. They're all found guilty of treason, and they're executed for treason. So he executes his second wife. His third wife, she ends up dying as a result of complications from childbirth, but his third wife finally has a son, Edward. Edward suffered from the complications of the birth as well. He never was an extremely healthy boy, and he didn't live very long. He died when he was 15 years old. Henry's fourth wife was also an adulterer, and he had her executed. His fifth wife, according to all accounts, was ugly all day. She climbed to the top of Mount Ugly, slipped on a loose rock 3 feet from the top, tumbled all the way down Mount Ugly and hit the ugly tree at the base of the mountain. This was an arranged marriage. He did not lay eyes on her in person until they were standing in front of the altar. He lifts up the veil and was like, "Oh God, what happened?" Now, she might not have been that hideous, but by all accounts, Henry thought she was, to use a country term, ugly as a mud fence. Apparently, they were married for less than a year, and Henry did everything he possibly could to avoid being home for the 10 months that they were married or so. Interesting thing is that while he didn't want to be married to her because of her physical looks, after they got a divorce again, he granted himself a divorce. After they divorced, she stayed in England. She stayed in the, court circles, and she continued to be a friend and trusted advisor of the king until his death. Sixth wife, nothing happened there. He didn't execute her. He didn't divorce her because he ended up dying before she would manage to do something to get on his bad side. Otherwise, it probably would have been the same way. But overall, he was married to 6 women. He executed 2 of them. He divorced 2 of them. One of them died before he did, and the 6th wife, he died before she did. Had 3 children, 2 daughters. His youngest child was a boy, so he did have a male heir. Edward ends up becoming king at the age of 7. Like I said, he was sickly. He was in poor health his entire life. He ends up dying at the age of 15. Now, Henry VIII's break with the Catholic Church, that ended the alliance with Spain because he divorced the King of Spain's daughter. So that ends the Spanish alliance. It also creates a lot of strife within the English community because of this separation. This is when the Protestant Reformation made it to England. You had the formation of the Church of England. So there's civil unrest there. And also, because Henry was constantly marrying and remarrying, trying to have a male heir, he was more focused on his personal issues than he was running the country, running a new church, expanding and setting up colonies. When Henry dies, Edward becomes Edward IV at the age of 7, becomes the King of England. He dies at the age of 15. Well, when he dies, of course, by 15, he wasn't married. He didn't have any children. So his oldest daughter, or his oldest sister, half-sister, Mary, from Henry's first marriage, ends up becoming the new Queen of England. She leaves Spain. She comes to England. She detests everything about her father's country. She even throws Elizabeth, her half-sister, in jail for a few months. Eventually, her advisors convinced her to release Elizabeth from prison, but then she still exiles her and keeps her essentially on house arrest in a countryside estate. Elizabeth was not allowed to return to London because Elizabeth was fairly popular with the royal court, and Mary didn't want the competition, I guess you could say. Mary ends up ruling over England for a handful of years, and she died. We'll just say she died by natural causes. She very easily could have died from not so natural causes, if you understand what I'm saying, but there's no proof one way or the other. 1588, Elizabeth I, Henry's second daughter, ends up taking the throne, and she was very resentful towards the Spanish because at this point, I believe it was one of Mary's brothers or cousins maybe had taken the throne, Philip II, and I think it was a cousin. And yes, this does sound weird, but sometimes to keep bloodlines pure, you would have arranged marriages between members of a royal family with cousins, just so you didn't have some foreign bloodline coming into the ruling line. Mary was supposed to get married to Philip. So then you have the King of Spain marrying the Queen of England, and that would basically merge the crowns of those two nations. Well, Mary dies, Elizabeth becomes queen, and almost immediately, I'm talking so inappropriate to the point that it's while not like at the funeral, but shortly after Mary passed, Elizabeth maybe hadn't even been coronated yet and officially crowned Queen of England. Philip II is essentially hitting on her. I always think of it, being like Joey from Friends. How you doing? And he proposes to her. He doesn't know Elizabeth, and he proposed to Elizabeth I numerous times over their reigns, thinking Spain is the greatest, one of the greatest nations in the world, one of the most powerful nations in Europe by far. She would be a fool not to accept his marriage proposal. And Elizabeth turned him down every time. She didn't like him. She thought it was scuzzy that he was proposing to her when he was supposed to marry her half-sister almost immediately after her half-sister died. So her constant rejections of Philip really intensify the rivalry with Catholic Spain. You also have issues during the reign of Henry VIII, Edward, Mary, Elizabeth, where the Catholics in Ireland, they're seeking help from the Spanish because they want to hold on to their faith. They don't want to adopt this new Protestant Anglican faith, as it was called. So the fact that the Spanish are aiding Catholic rebels in Ireland against Protestant English rule, that further intensifies the rivalry. Well, because the Spanish got involved aiding Catholics in Ireland, Elizabeth does the same thing in different parts of Europe where Catholic Spain was trying to impose Catholic rule on Protestant groups of people, even though England had no real connection to them. So Spain interferes in the political/religious issues in the English kingdom. England does the same thing to Spain, trying to promote Protestantism. The help that the Spanish gave the Catholic Irish never really amounted to much. Elizabeth ended up crushing any opposition that the Irish were able to mount, confiscated lands, planted Protestant English nobles to keep the Irish under control. Also pulled some Scottish in, and because they were loyal to the English crown, planted them as nobles in Ireland. again, to help keep the Irish under control. A lot of English soldiers developed a great deal of, I say contempt, might go as far as to say hatred for the natives in Ireland. That's an attitude that they would carry over into the New World in terms of how they dealt with Native Americans. Now, since I spent so much time talking about that, I'm going to go through this slide pretty quick. Again, you all have access to these. You can read through them on your own. Jamestown was not the first attempt at colonization by the English. Late in Elizabeth's rule, they did consider colonizing. 1583, Sir Humphrey Gilbert ended up planning the first English settlement in North America, but he ended up dying less than halfway across the Atlantic. He got sick during the voyage across the Atlantic. They weren't even halfway to the New World, so they turned around. They ended up going back to England, and everything gets put on hold. 2 years later, or really it was more like a year and a half later, Gilbert's half-brother, this is a name you probably have already heard of from middle school history classes, Sir Walter Raleigh. Gilbert's half-brother, 1585, there was still some money, there were still some resources, there were people that his brother had made connections with, that Raleigh, when he ends up gathering together the money, the resources, he sees his brother's plan to set up a private colony. He decides that he's going to do the same thing. He ends up establishing a colony on Roanoke Island off the coast of Virginia. Roanoke's referred to as the Lost Colony because they planted the colony, and that's something you're going to hear a lot here in the next couple of chapters, is a colony being planted like a seed would be. Basically, they drop off the first round of colonists. They get defensive walls established, and then the ship leaves. The ship that dropped them off goes back to England for the winter. They're going to resupply. They're going to come back in the spring with more settlers, with more supplies, and you would grow the colony from there. Hopefully, after a couple of years of bringing more settlers, bringing more supplies, that initial colony, kind of like if you plant some sort of plant in a small pot, as it grows, you need to move to a bigger pot. The plan was set this colony up on this island just off the coast of Virginia, and then as the colony grows, well, everyone will pack up and they'll move to the mainland. And that's where you would establish the main colony, not the state Maine, as in the primary colony, I guess should have said. Well, in 1588, you have the attempted invasion of England by the Spanish Armada, which at that point in history was the largest naval fleet ever assembled. And the English soundly defeated the Spanish Armada. This does two things. A, you end up seeing a huge decline in Spanish power. Now, after the defeat of the Spanish Armada, because they lost like 75% of the ships that they sent to invade England, they lost about 75% of those total ships. Now they didn't have the naval resources to protect all of the gold, all of the sugar that was being produced in the Caribbean islands. They didn't have the naval resources to protect their merchant ships that were traveling to and from Europe back to North America. That is going to make piracy a lot easier. It's going, a privateer, if you don't know what a privateer is essentially a pirate that has official government papers. Sir Francis Drake was a privateer. The only reason that he wasn't considered a pirate is we're talking about American history. If this was Spain and we were talking Spanish history, he would probably be considered a pirate because he raided Spanish ships. He didn't attack English ships. A pirate is an outlaw. A pirate would attack any ships, but a privateer works for one government or another. Other country, the French, the Spanish, they had privateers as well, but Sir Francis Drake just happened to be an English privateer. Now, after the defeat of the Spanish Armada, Spanish power starts to fall into decline. England, of course, is starting to become more powerful. After the defeat of the Spanish Armada, this makes Great Britain the most powerful, or England, I'm sorry, the most powerful navy in the world. And that's a title that England would hold, the most powerful navy in the world, until the end of World War I, going into World War II. The beginning of World War II, once the United States gets involved in World War II, we build the most powerful navy in the world, and we still hold that title to this day. Where the English held that title for well over 300 years. We've only held the title since 1942, but at this time, I think we have the largest navy in the world, and I think our navy is larger than number 2, number 3, and number 4 combined. We have a massive naval force. Now, since England now had the most dominant navy in the world, it was time to start thinking about colonization, but the first 2 attempts that the English had done failed. Elizabeth dies in 1603. Her cousin James ends up becoming James I. He was the King of Scotland. She did not have any children of her own, so the closest living relative ends up becoming the new monarch of England. She dies in 1603 without an heir. King James of Scotland becomes James I, King of England. He signs a peace treaty with Spain, and now that there is peace with Spain, the established force in the New World, you're able to expand the colonies. Another thing that pushes them during the mid to late 1500s to colonize in the early 1600s is a huge population boom. The population in England grew by 33%. That's like saying in the span of 50 years, that would be like saying if England had, now England's population wasn't this big at this point, but it's like saying if you had 30 million people, in only 50 years, the population jumped to 40 million. It grew by 1/3 in that span. England is a relatively, when you look, especially compared to the United States today, you look at England geographically is very small. So any population growth is going to end up making things seem very much more crowded. And when your population grows that fast, it makes the feeling of being overcrowded much more dramatic, I guess you would say. There was an economic depression, and that is what's going to provide America with its first immigrants. Landlords were fencing in their fields to allow for grazing land for sheep. When they start putting fences up, that cuts down on tenant farmers' ability to grow crops and possibly the best land. Also, what was referred to as the laws of primogeniture. The eldest son inherits everything when the father dies. Causes younger sons, if you've got a family that has 6 kids and 4 sons, the oldest son's going to inherit everything, and number 2, number 3, and number 4 are either going to have to work for their brother, or they've got to find something else to do. That's what Sir Walter Raleigh was, Sir Humphrey Gilbert, Sir Francis Drake. They were all nobles. They were all parts of important families, but they weren't the firstborn son, so they had to find new ways to make money. Raleigh and Gilbert's plan was to establish a private colony that they were in charge of, so people paid them taxes, as opposed to if you lived in England, you paid the government taxes. Drake, he ends up contracting as a privateer, and that's how he made money, from basically robbing Spanish ships. He got to keep a cut, and he also, from time to time, would pass some of the stuff that he acquired onto the English crown. He had a very close relationship with Elizabeth I. Now, talk here about the birth of the joint stock company. Works a lot like modern corporations, where people can buy stock. They invest money in a company, in a venture, and then you get a profit. You get a return based off of the size of your initial investment. Peace with Spain allowed for the English to start to colonize without fear of Spanish encroachment, but that doesn't account for any confrontations they might run into with natives. The population supplied workers that were eager to leave England and possibly start a new life somewhere else. 1606, the Virginia Company ends up receiving a charter from King James I for settlement in the New World. The Virginia Company, joint stock company, was only supposed to form and last for 5 years. It was supposed to be a temporary investment, kind of like if you ever watch any of those shows on like TLC or channels like that on cable, satellite, whatever you've got, where people flip houses. They buy a house really cheap. They make cosmetic changes to it, fix it up to make it look better, and then they try to sell it within 3 weeks, a month, something like that. That's what the Virginia Company was essentially going to do. The investment, the corporation, was only supposed to last for 5 years, I think, was the far outlook. You invest money, we get a colony established, we sell land off to people to make money one way. Any resources that are being harvested, that actually belongs to the joint stock company. So that's another way that we can make money. And then after 5 years, we're going to sell off everything that the company still holds. And the profit is going to end up being split among the investors. That was the initial plan. Didn't quite work out that way. The charter was very important. The charter that the Virginia Company got from the king, because it guaranteed the people that lived in Virginia the same rights as an Englishman living at home in England. Ironically, 150 years later, when the gears start moving towards revolution after the French and Indian War, it's the colonists' insistence on the rights of Englishmen that's going to create more and more friction with the crown until eventually, we do revolt against English rule in 1775. May 24th, 1607 is when Jamestown, the first English permanent settlement in North America, ends up being founded. Very hard going the first few years. Disease, malnutrition, starvation were all problems because, especially due to the fact that these early colonists, they didn't know how to survive. They weren't survivalists. You were taking farmers, you were taking office clerks in towns or cities that just heard these stories and thought that they were going to go to the New World, that they were going to go to England. They were not going to go to England, that they were going to leave England, that they were going to go to the New World, and they were going to start a new life, and they were going to end up getting rich and living out their wildest dreams. It wasn't that easy. I mean, if you've ever watched anything like Naked and Afraid or Life Below Zero or any of those survivalist shows, competitions, even people that are highly trained have a very hard time surviving in the wilderness on their own. And I feel like it would be even more complicated if you have a group of people that are all untrained, unaccustomed to having to hunt and forage for their food. I mean, farmers can grow food, but you're moving far to the west, you're moving farther south, the climate's different, agriculture is going to work a little differently. And when you have people that aren't used to foraging, aren't used to hunting, you also have to compete with Native Americans for land, because the English come in, they settle in, they just kind of kick the doors open and say, oh, nobody's here, this is ours now. Well, there were Native Americans that lived in that area. They hunted in those areas. And as the English start to clear land to plant crops, that disrupts life for the Native Americans and thus creates conflict between the English settlers and the Native Americans in the region. Virginia ends up being saved from collapse by a man named John Smith in 1608. He was not a leader within the settlement. People kind of looked at him because he was a natural leader, but he did not hold a position within the Virginia Company. He enacted a rule, said, if you don't work, you don't eat. Which there were some people that maybe they were middle class in England. They come back or they come to the New World and they didn't think that they should be required to work for a living. These people beneath them should end up doing all the work. They were used to being the boss. Well, Smith said, look, we're so short on resources, it's all hands on deck. If you don't help, you don't get a share of the food. You've got to stand watch, you've got to do this, you've got to do that. Or, if you can't hunt, if you don't know how to farm, you don't know how to hunt, you're going to have to do something else in the community. Otherwise, we're not going to take care of you if you don't help take care of us. Smith ends up getting kidnapped in December of 1607. That first winter, I think he was on patrol or he was out hunting. I'm not quite sure how he managed to be away from the settlement when he gets kidnapped. But what happens is he gets kidnapped by some of the local natives. This is where he meets Pocahontas, but if you've ever watched the animated Pocahontas movie, that is completely off base and wrong. John Smith was probably 30 to 35 years old. Pocahontas was more like 10 to 12. As far as I know, there was nothing romantic between them, nothing creepy there, but it's a situation where the animated story of Pocahontas is way off base. There was not a romantic interest with Pocahontas. But what happens is Smith is kidnapped. He does form a friendship with Pocahontas, who was the daughter of the chieftain Powhatan. And because of the bond that they had, he ends up being the bridge between the natives in the region led by Powhatan and the English settlers. That peace ends up being upheld for a period of time, but eventually more English come in. Smith is no longer in a leadership position, and that's when the alliance falls apart. Very first couple of winters were extremely rough. Natives helped the colonists, but English still died in droves from disease, from starvation. At one point, the winters of 1608, 1609 were extremely harsh. There are stories, there are journals, there are letters that were written back to family in England, stories of having to resort to eating cats, dogs, mice, if you could catch them in bad situations. In the worst situation, there is at least one or two cases where settlers were digging up, as people died of starvation. There was one story of a man whose wife died, and because it was so cold that winter, the excuse was, well, she's just sick. Nobody had seen her for several weeks. They would stop by, and he'd just crack the door open and say, "Oh, she's not really feeling up to having visitors right now. Come back in a couple of days. Maybe she'll feel a little bit better." But it turns out that the man's wife had died from starvation, and little by little, he was eating parts of her. And because it was so cold, she wasn't, the body wasn't decaying and spoiling as quickly as it would if it had been warmer. There are also stories about people digging up newly buried bodies before decay really set in and resorting to cannibalism. So things had to be bad for stuff like that to happen. Out of the 400 English that came to Jamestown in 1609, there were only 60 survivors left in the colony by the spring of 1610. And they were mostly packed up, ready to go back to England. Well, when the ships arrived in the spring of 1610, they are met by more settlers and a new governor appointed by the Joint Stock Company, Lord Delaware, and that is where the name of the colony and eventual state, Delaware, gets its name. Delaware, he ends up, he was a military man, and his thing was, we've had reports, and of course these reports were a year or 2 years old, of conflict with Native Americans. So he brings in a group of private soldiers hired, paid by the Joint Stock Company to make war with the natives. He breaks the peace with the Powhatan tribe. They go to war. By 1625, only 1,200 out of 8,000 colonists that had come from 1607 to 1625, 8,000 people had come to Jamestown, the Virginia colony. Only 1,200 people were still alive at that point, between warfare, between starvation, between disease. not being able to live off the land. Now, what happens is you just have years between Delaware arriving and about 1620, 1625, where constant conflict just led to massive death on both sides. 1610, Delaware arrives. He has orders from the Virginia Company to take control of the situation. He introduces the use of what were referred to by English soldiers as Irish tactics against the Native Americans, raiding villages, burning houses, confiscating, any, provisions, smoked meat, salted meat, grains that had been harvested, torching fields, and doing whatever they can to try to drive the natives off this land so the English can settle here peacefully. 1614, you have the beginning of the First Anglo-Powhatan War. That was ended with the marriage of Pocahontas to the colonist John Rolfe. Rolfe will eventually go on to make a name for himself in the tobacco industry. 1622, Indian attacks end up leaving about 350 settlers dead on the frontier. And of course, that means that there's going to be an English response. Now, 1644 to 46, you have the Second Anglo-Powhatan War. That was the last real attempt that the natives in the region made to try to drive the English out of the Chesapeake Bay area. It fails, and over the next 40 years, it's just constantly pushing the natives farther and farther off the coast. By the time you get to 1685, the Powhatan tribe, which they didn't call themselves the Powhatan. Pocahontas's father, he had been the first chieftain that the English had come into contact with, so they just called all of the Indians or Native Americans in that region Powhatan Indians. And again, the whole reason people call Native Americans Indians is because Columbus thought that he was in the in the East Indies, in the East Asia. Now, let's see. I'll talk about this slide here, and we'll go ahead and call it a day. Just like with the Spanish, your English coming in and settling in North America greatly disrupts life for Native Americans on a large scale. Introduction of the horse causes migration onto the Great Plains by the time you get into the early 1700s. For most of the 1600s, the Native Americans that were on the coast when the English arrive, they're still going to be east of the Appalachian Mountains. But after 1685, you're going to see a push, and a lot of those Native Americans are going to end up migrating west of the mountains into the Ohio River Valley, the Great Lakes region, and eventually across the Mississippi into the Great Plains. The Lakota Sioux, they had originally been forest dwellers on the East Coast or in the eastern United States, as opposed to, if you watch Westerns that are set in the late 19th century and the late 1800s, the Lakota Nation is in maybe a little bit of Wisconsin, North and South Dakota, maybe as far west as Montana, maybe dipping down into like Iowa, but their ancestors had been on the Atlantic coast at one point, and European colonization is what drove the Lakota Sioux into the plains. European diseases wiped out entire cultures, created some new ones. Tribal elders passed their culture, their history on through oral tradition. As older generations were gone, you had a small group from this tribe, a small group from this tribe, a small group from this tribe, and they kind of find each other, their safety in numbers, and the cultures would mix, and it would end up creating new tribes, new languages, or at least new dialects. Like I said, forced migration, what I talk about right here, forced migration ends up sometimes mixing remnants of different tribes together, and you have new nations formed, like the Catawba tribe. The Catawba tribe did not exist until post-European colonization. European trade, in some cases, you have French or English settlers that become allied with certain Native American tribes, and to bring peace between the English and, for example, the Iroquois tribe. We'll just use that as an example. The English might trade firearms to this friendly group of Native Americans, and that group, the Iroquois, would then in turn use those firearms against the Huron, who were allies of the French. And the Huron did the same thing. They became friendly with the French because the French were enemies of the British. The Iroquois were enemies of the Huron, so the enemy of my enemy is my friend. The Huron would partner up with the French. The French would give them weapons to make war on the Iroquois and the British. Now, Native Americans that lived farther off the coast had more time to prepare, strengthen their resistance against European expansion, but resistance, if you're a Star Trek fan, resistance is futile. Eventually, the Europeans are going to keep coming in larger and larger numbers. They're going to end up pushing farther and farther west, and they're going to continue to push the Native American population off of that territory. Now, I think we're going to go ahead and call it a day here. I will pick up here next time I make a video, and I should end up putting that up next Friday. If you all have any questions, if you have any comments or anything like that, make sure to email me, post on the Google Classroom, and I will talk to you all later.